When did saving someone's life ruin yours? Students at my high school were forbidden from entering the teacher workroom under any circumstances. If you even poked your head in, you got detention. Ms. Baker was my AP chemistry teacher, and the only reason I had a shot at getting into college. She wrote me recommendation letters and actually gave a shit whether I understood the material. She also had severe asthma that had been getting worse all winter. She kept her emergency inhaler in her desk drawer in the classroom, but I'd noticed her using it more often, sometimes 3 times during one class period. She'd pause mid-sentence, take a hit, and keep teaching like it was normal. A few times, she'd had to sit down and let us work independently while she caught her breath. We all pretended not to notice because she was the best teacher we had, and nobody wanted her to take medical leave. One day, she mentioned her doctor had prescribed a stronger inhaler that she kept in the workroom because it was expensive and she didn't want it stolen from her desk. She joked that it cost more than her car payment, which wasn't really funny because we all knew teachers made shit money. She'd been trying to get approval to keep it in the classroom, but the administration said controlled medications had to stay in locked areas, meaning either the nurse's office across campus or the teacher workroom. I'd been staying after school that Thursday to retake a test I'd bombed because my dad had been in the hospital that week. Ms. Baker had offered to let me retake it, even though her policy was no retakes, because she knew I'd been at the hospital every night. She was supposed to be grading while I tested, but she'd gone to get her regular inhaler from her desk and realized it was empty. She stood up to go to the workroom for her emergency inhaler, but suddenly she couldn't even make it to the door. Her wheezing turned into this horrible whistling sound, and she collapsed against her desk, gasping like a fish out of water. Her lips were turning blue and her eyes were huge with panic. I ran to the door and screamed for help, but it was after 4 and the hallways were empty. The nurse had left at 3:30 like always. The workroom was just 3 doors down, and Ms. Baker managed to gasp out, "Workroom, inhaler, shelf by coffee." I ran to the workroom and yanked the door open. I found her inhaler exactly where she said, grabbed it, and was running back when I saw them. The final exams for every AP class were spread out on the big table, including mine. Chemistry equations I'd been struggling with for weeks were right there with the answers printed below them. I only saw them for maybe 2 seconds, but my brain photographed everything because those were the exact problems I couldn't solve. Ms. Baker was barely conscious when I got back. I helped her use the inhaler, holding it steady because her hands were shaking too bad. It took 3 doses before she could breathe normally again. She kept thanking me while we waited for the paramedics, saying I'd saved her life. She didn't know I'd just accidentally destroyed my entire future by seeing those tests. I thought maybe it wouldn't matter. I hadn't meant to look. I was saving someone's life. But Cameron had been in the hallway and saw me come out of the workroom. His dad was on the school board and Cameron hated me because I'd beaten him for valedictorian. He reported it immediately, probably before Ms. Rodriguez even got to the hospital. The next morning, Principal Harris called me into his office. He had security footage pulled up on his computer showing me exiting the workroom with the inhaler. Ms. Baker was there too, still weak from yesterday but trying to defend me. "She saved my life," Ms. Baker kept saying. "I would have died without that inhaler." Principal Harris nodded sympathetically, but pulled out a form. "I understand the circumstances, but the fact remains that she entered the workroom and was exposed to secure testing materials. The academic integrity policy is clear." He turned to me. "All your grades for this semester will be marked as void. You'll have to retake everything in summer school if you want to graduate." I felt my chest getting tight, like I was the one who couldn't breathe. But I didn't even mean to see them. I was saving her life. "The rule exists precisely because we can't determine intent after the fact," he said, typing something into his computer. "I've already notified all your teachers and the college you committed to. Your acceptance will likely be rescinded." He looked at Ms. Baker. "I'm sorry, but if we make an exception here, every student who enters that room will claim it was an emergency." Ms. Baker started crying, which made it worse. "This is my fault. I'm the one who couldn't breathe. She's losing her future because she saved me." "The rule is the rule," Principal Harris said, already printing out the forms that would destroy everything I'd worked for. "Her heroism is admirable, but academic integrity must be maintained." The stack of papers landed on the desk in front of me with a soft thud that felt like thunder in my chest. My fingers wouldn't work right when I tried to pick them up. The forms kept sliding around because my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't grip them. Mrs. Baker's crying got louder behind me and she stood up from her chair so fast it scraped against the floor. She slammed her palm on Principal Harris's desk and said she'd quit if they did this to me. He didn't even look up from his computer screen while he kept clicking and typing and printing more papers. The printer kept spitting out page after page while Ms. Baker's voice got higher and more desperate. I watched my name appear on form after form, each one stamping out another piece of my future. My legs felt like water and I had to grab the edge of the desk to stay standing. Principal Harris finally looked up and pushed the whole stack toward me with 2 fingers. He told me to sign them all and return them by end of day tomorrow. Ms. Baker grabbed my arm and steered me toward the door while tears ran down her face. The hallway outside his office felt too bright after the dim fluorescent lights inside. Jasmine jumped up from the bench where she'd been waiting and her face changed the second she saw mine. She didn't need to ask what happened because she could see it written all over me. I tried to tell her about the grades being voided and the college acceptance getting pulled, but the words came out in broken pieces. She wrapped both arms around me and pulled me against her while my knees gave out. We sank down to the floor right there in the hallway while I sobbed into her shoulder. Her hands rubbed circles on my back while she whispered that we'd figure something out. Ms. Baker stood over us with her hand pressed against the wall for support. Her face was gray, and she looked like she might pass out again. She kept saying sorry over and over until I pulled away from Jasmine to look at her. I told her this wasn't her fault, and that I'd do the same thing again, even knowing what would happen. She shook her head and promised she wouldn't let this stand, but we all knew she had no power here. The drive home felt like it took forever, even though it was only 10 minutes. Mom was in the kitchen packing dinner to take to the hospital when I walked in. But she took one look at my face and froze with a container of soup in her hands. I had to explain everything 3 times before she really understood what had happened. The container hit the counter so hard the lid popped off and soup splashed everywhere. She didn't even notice while she grabbed her phone and started scrolling through contacts. Her fingers moved so fast across the screen I could hear the clicking sounds. She called 4 different lawyers in 20 minutes while pacing back and forth across the kitchen. Each conversation ended the same way with her asking about payment plans we both knew we couldn't afford. Her hand shook when she wrote down the prices they quoted on the back of an envelope. The numbers got bigger with each call until she finally threw the phone on the table. We drove to the hospital in silence except for her knuckles cracking as she gripped the steering wheel. Dad was sitting up in bed watching the news when we walked into his room. His face lit up for a second before he saw our expressions and the smile died. Mom handed him the stack of forms from the school while I sat in the visitor chair. He read each page slowly with his reading glasses sliding down his nose. The heart monitor next to his bed started beeping faster as he got through the stack. He kept asking about appeals and hearings and due process while shuffling through the papers again. Mom had to tell him 3 times that the lawyers all said the policy was airtight. His face got paler with each repetition until the nurse came in to check why his vitals were spiking. We had to pretend everything was fine until she left. Dad tried to sit up straighter but winced and had to lean back against the pillows. He told me we'd find a way to fight this, even if it meant going to the media. Jasmine had already started working on that without me even asking. My phone buzzed nonstop on the drive home with notifications from a group chat she'd created. 20 kids from the school were already in it sharing their own stories about zero-tolerance policies. Someone's older brother got suspended for having Advil in his backpack. Another kid lost his spot on the soccer team for being late to practice when his mom's car broke down. Everyone had some story about how the rules had screwed them over. Patrick said his mom worked at the newspaper and might be able to help. The messages kept coming faster than I could read them. Someone started a petition that got 50 signatures in the first hour. By the time I got home, Jasmine had turned my disaster into a full campaign. The next morning I had to go back to the school and face everyone. Walking through the front doors felt like walking into a funeral where I was the corpse. Kids stopped talking when I passed and teachers gave me these sad looks. Cameron was waiting by my locker with the biggest grin I'd ever seen on his face. He said loud enough for everyone to hear that I should have followed the rules. Jasmine lunged at him before I could grab her arm. I had to wrap both arms around her waist and drag her backward while she screamed at him. He just laughed and walked away while everyone stared at us. Logan Hood appeared out of nowhere and steered us into an empty classroom. He closed the door and pulled a folded paper from his pocket. He'd been getting calls from teachers all morning who were pissed about what happened. Half the staff thought it was wrong but couldn't say anything without risking their jobs. The paper had all the school board members' contact info with their phone numbers and emails. He pressed it into my hand and told me to make them listen before slipping back into the hallway. That night, my phone lit up with a text from Ms. Baker saying she'd been called to meet with the superintendent tomorrow. She planned to take full blame and beg them to reverse my punishment. I texted back that she shouldn't risk her job for me, but she replied that she couldn't live with this guilt. 3 days crawled by with more meetings and phone calls that went nowhere. Then Juan Wen from the local paper called our house asking for my side of the story. Mom's first instinct was to say no and protect me from more attention. But I grabbed the phone and told Hua we needed people to know what really happened. We agreed to meet at the coffee shop downtown the next afternoon. The coffee shop was packed when I got there, but Hua had grabbed a corner table with her laptop already open and a recorder sitting next to her coffee cup. She stood up when she saw me and shook my hand with this really firm grip that made me feel like she took this seriously. I sat down and she pushed a water bottle across the table toward me before pulling out a yellow legal pad covered in notes she'd already made about my case. She started by asking me to walk her through everything from the beginning, taking notes as I explained about Miss Baker's asthma getting worse over the winter and how she'd been using her inhaler more and more. When I got to the part about the nurse leaving at 3:30 every day, she stopped writing and looked up at me with her mouth open. She asked me to repeat that part, and I told her again that the nurse always left at 3:30 no matter what, even though after-school activities went until 5 or 6. She wrote that down and underlined it 3 times before asking about the distance to the nearest hospital. I told her it was 15 minutes by car if you hit all the green lights, maybe 20 with normal traffic. She shook her head and muttered something about liability before asking me to continue. I explained Ms. Baker had collapsed and couldn't even make it to the door, how her lips were turning blue and she was gasping for air. Hua's hand was moving so fast across the paper I thought she might get a cramp. But she asked about the workroom policy, and I told her how no student was ever allowed in there for any reason, how kids got detention just for poking their heads in the door. She wanted to know exactly where the emergency medications were kept in the workroom, and I described the shelf by the coffee maker where Ms. Baker's expensive inhaler sat. She asked if there were any other places the inhaler could have been stored, and I explained about the nurse's office being across campus. At least a 3-minute run each way if you were really booking it. She closed her notebook and looked me straight in the eyes, telling me this was one of the worst policy failures she'd seen in 20 years of reporting. The next morning at the school, I walked in to find Jasmine standing with about 50 other kids outside Principal Harris's office, all of them holding signs made from poster board and markers. Some said she saved a life, and others had heroes don't deserve punishment, written in big black letters. Jasmine saw me and waved me over, but I shook my head because I didn't want to make things worse for myself. Principal Harris came out of his office and his face went red when he saw all the kids standing there silently. He told everyone they had 2 minutes to disperse or he'd start handing out detentions. Nobody moved at first. Then he pulled out his phone and called security. 2 security guards showed up and started telling kids to get to class, but someone was recording the whole thing on their phone. I saw at least 3 teachers watching from their classroom windows, including Mr. Peterson, who gave Jasmine a thumbs up before ducking back inside. The security guards started taking names, and that's when kids finally started walking away. But the damage was done because the video was already getting uploaded. I went to my next class and tried to focus, but my phone kept buzzing with notifications from people sharing the protest video. At lunch, I was sitting with Jasmine when my phone dinged with an email notification from the college I was supposed to attend in the fall. My hands were shaking as I opened it and read the first line confirming that my acceptance had been officially rescinded due to the academic integrity violation. They said they understood the circumstances were unusual, but their policy didn't allow for exceptions when it came to test security breaches. I felt my chest get tight, and before I even knew what I was doing, I threw my phone across the cafeteria. It hit the wall and I heard the screen crack, which made everything worse because now I'd have to explain to Mom why I needed a new phone we couldn't afford. Jasmine grabbed my arm and dragged me to the bathroom where I just stood there shaking while she told me we'd figure something out. That's when we heard that Ms. Baker hadn't shown up for school that day, or the next day, or the day after that. The substitute teacher, Mrs. Chen, told the class that Ms. Baker had left detailed lesson plans for the next week and a note asking everyone to be understanding about my situation. Someone said they'd heard Ms. Baker had a nervous breakdown and was in the hospital, but Mrs. Chen said that wasn't true, just that Ms. Baker needed some time. Half the kids in AP Chemistry refused to do any work, just sitting there with their books closed while Mrs. Chen tried to teach. She finally gave up and let everyone have a study hall instead. Mom took time off work to meet with Logan Hood about what options we had for me to still graduate. He pulled out this massive binder full of summer school information and started going through all the requirements. I'd have to retake 6 full courses in just 8 weeks, which meant being in class from 7 in the morning until 7 at night every single day, including Saturdays. The cost made Mom's face go white when he said it would be $3,000 total, not including books and supplies. She asked if there was financial aid available, and he shook his head, saying summer school was considered remedial and didn't qualify for any assistance programs. Mom wrote down all the information, but I could see her doing the math in her head and knowing we didn't have that kind of money. 2 days later, there was a school board meeting, and Cameron's dad stood up to make a statement about maintaining academic integrity. He said that making exceptions for emotional situations would create chaos and undermine the entire education system. His wife sat next to him looking like she wanted to disappear into her chair, staring at her hands folded in her lap, while he talked about the importance of rules. Someone in the back was recording him on their phone when he said, "Rules are rules" 3 times in a row, like it was some kind of magic spell that made everything okay. The video was online within an hour, and people were already making memes out of his face when he said it. Marina never looked up once during his entire speech, and when he sat down, she scooted her chair slightly away from him. The next day after school, I was walking to my car when the janitor, Mr. Flores, called out to me from where he was emptying trash cans. He walked over and told me he'd seen everything that day, how I'd been crying while helping Ms. Baker use her inhaler. He said in 30 years of working at the school, this was the most shameful thing he'd ever seen the administration do. He pulled out a little notebook from his pocket and wrote down his phone number, tearing off the page and pressing it into my hand. He told me to call if I needed him to testify about what he saw, that he didn't care if it made Principal Harris mad because some things were more important than keeping your head down. That same evening, Jasmine's mom called our house and talked to Mom for almost an hour. She was a nurse at the regional hospital and had written up a whole medical assessment about Ms. Baker's asthma attack. She broke down exactly how many minutes someone could survive without oxygen when their airways were that constricted, explaining that Ms. Baker would have had permanent brain damage or died if I'd waited even 2 more minutes. She'd already submitted her report to the school board and sent a copy to Hua at the newspaper, including statistics about how many people die from asthma attacks when they can't get their medication in time. The medical details were really technical, but the bottom line was clear that Ms. Baker would have died. A week later, I was eating breakfast when Mom showed me her phone with Hua's article pulled up on the screen. The headline read, "Local student punished for saving teacher's life," in huge letters across the top of the page. The article included quotes from 3 different medical professionals about asthma emergencies and a whole section about zero-tolerance policy failures in schools across the country. The comment section already had over 200 responses, and they were coming in faster than I could read them. People were calling the school, demanding answers, sharing their own stories about stupid policies that hurt kids. Someone had even started a petition that already had 500 signatures. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a school-wide email from Principal Harris defending the decision and warning against trial by media, which just made people angrier. He wrote that the school had to maintain standards, and that making exceptions would create chaos, basically repeating everything Cameron's dad had said at the board meeting. 3 different teachers found me throughout the day to quietly tell me they thought the whole thing was disgusting, but they couldn't say anything publicly without risking their jobs. The next evening, I was helping Mom clean up after dinner when someone knocked on our door. Marina Suarez stood on our porch holding her purse tight against her chest. She pushed a check into Mom's hands before either of us could say anything. The amount was exactly what we needed for summer school fees, plus a little extra. Mom tried to give it back, but Marina grabbed her hands and held them closed around the check. She told us not to tell her husband and practically ran back to her car before we could argue. Mom stood there crying while I watched Marina's taillights disappear down our street. 2 days later, the superintendent's office called to schedule a meeting with me, my parents, and Principal Harris. Dad had to leave the hospital early, and Mom had to take time off work without pay. We sat in this big conference room while the superintendent explained my options like she was doing me some kind of favor. She suggested I could take a gap year and try again next year with different colleges. I pointed out that still meant losing everything I'd worked for. She kept nodding and making sympathetic faces but offered nothing that actually helped. Principal Harris sat there looking satisfied the whole time. When Ms. Baker came back to the school the following Monday, she looked terrible. Her hair was gray at the roots and she had dark circles under her eyes. She tried to teach but kept stopping to stare at my empty desk. Other kids texted me that she started crying in the middle of explaining chemical bonds. They said she'd been going to every administrator's office during her lunch breaks trying to get them to reconsider. Nobody would listen to her. She even went to the district office 3 times that week. About 2 weeks after everything started, I got a call from Logan Hood saying 3 board members had requested a special session to review the policy. Clint Suarez fought against having the meeting but got outvoted 4-3. They scheduled the hearing for the following Tuesday and said I could present my case. Jasmine came over that same night with her laptop and a stack of folders. We worked at my kitchen table, organizing everything into a presentation that would show exactly what happened. She made a timeline showing every second from when Ms. Baker collapsed to when the paramedics arrived. We collected witness statements from everyone who'd seen any part of what happened. Jasmine's mom gave us the medical report showing Ms. Baker would have died in under 3 minutes without her inhaler. We practiced my presentation over and over until 2 in the morning every night. Dad watched us practice through video calls from his hospital bed and helped us strengthen our arguments. The night before the hearing, I went to get milk at the grocery store. Cameron was there buying energy drinks and saw me in the dairy aisle. He walked over without his usual smirk and stood there looking at the floor. He told me his mom had been fighting with his dad about the whole situation every night. He didn't say sorry, but he also didn't act like he'd won anything. He just grabbed his drinks and left. The board meeting room was packed when we arrived Tuesday evening. Students filled every seat and lined the walls. Teachers who couldn't speak publicly were there to show support. Parents and community members squeezed into every available space. I set up my presentation materials with shaking hands while everyone watched. When they called me to present, I walked through every single second of the emergency. I showed them the timeline and the medical evidence. I described Ms. Baker's lips turning blue and her eyes rolling back. Several board members shifted in their seats when I explained how her breathing sounded like a whistle getting quieter and quieter. I showed them photos of the workroom door and the distance to the nurse's office. I explained that waiting for someone else would have meant watching her die. Ms. Baker testified next about her asthma and how the medication storage rules created danger for teachers with health conditions. She started crying when she explained she'd rather have died than see me lose my future for saving her. She told them about trying to get permission to keep her inhaler in the classroom for months. The board members looked uncomfortable when she described how many times she'd almost had attacks with no way to get to her medication fast enough. She said other teachers with diabetes and heart conditions face the same problems every day. Clint Suarez stood up to argue that emotions shouldn't override policies. He warned about setting dangerous precedents if they made exceptions. Right in the middle of his speech, Marina stood up and walked out of the room. Everyone turned to watch her leave. Clint stopped talking for a second and his face turned red. He kept going, but his voice wasn't as confident anymore. He said rules existed for good reasons, and breaking them even once would create chaos. The janitor testified last about what he'd witnessed that day. He described finding me crying while holding the inhaler to Ms. Baker's mouth. He said her lips were purple and she wasn't moving except for tiny gasps. He told them he'd worked at the school for 30 years and never seen anything more wrong than punishing me for saving a life. He said he'd cleaned up after hundreds of kids who'd broken actual rules and hurt people. He said what I did was the opposite of that, and everyone knew it. The board members started talking among themselves while we all waited, and after what felt like forever but was probably only 20 minutes, the chairman called for the vote on whether to grant me a special exception based on the life-threatening emergency. One by one, they raised their hands, and when the 5th hand went up in my favor, the whole room exploded with people clapping and cheering, while Clint grabbed his stuff and stormed out without even waiting for the meeting to end. The chairman banged his gavel and told Principal Harris he had to restore all my grades right away, and notify the college that the violation was reversed, and Principal Harris pulled out his laptop right there at the table and started typing with his jaw so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He printed out the confirmation sheet from the printer behind him and walked over to hand it to me without looking at my face, just staring at some spot over my shoulder while the paper shook slightly in his hand. I took it and my mom grabbed me in this huge hug while everyone was still clapping and Ms. Baker was crying again. But this time they were happy tears, and even some of the board members were smiling and nodding at me. We stayed for another hour while they finished other business, but I couldn't focus on any of it because I kept reading that confirmation paper over and over, seeing my grades restored and the violation marked as reversed due to emergency exception. When we finally got home, it was almost midnight, and I fell into bed still wearing my clothes from the meeting, too exhausted to even change or check my phone, even though it had been buzzing nonstop with texts from friends who'd heard the news. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:30, and when I saw it was the college admissions office, my heart started pounding, so hard I could barely press the answer button. The woman on the other end apologized for everything that had happened and said they were reinstating my acceptance immediately and would expedite my financial aid package to make sure everything was ready for fall semester. I collapsed back on my bed with the phone still pressed to my ear while she explained the next steps. And my mom must have heard me crying because she came running in, and I could only manage to nod and give her a thumbs up while the admissions officer kept talking. Mom grabbed the phone from me and started talking to the woman herself, asking questions about housing. An orientation while I just lay there feeling like my chest might explode from relief. And then she called Dad at the hospital and put him on speaker so he could hear the good news too. That afternoon, I went back to the school to clean out my locker since I'd been avoiding the place for weeks, and Ms. Baker must have been watching for me because she came running down the hallway and wrapped me in this hug that lasted so long other teachers started staring. She was crying and laughing at the same time, telling me she'd submitted a proposal for locked emergency medication boxes in every hallway so no one would ever have to choose between following rules and saving a life again. She pulled back and held my shoulders, looking right at me with her eyes all red and puffy, and told me she was dedicating her Teacher of the Year award to me because I'd shown more courage than any adult in that building. I started crying too, and we just stood there in the hallway holding each other while students walked around us, some of them patting my back or saying congratulations as they passed. Over the next few days, I noticed Cameron wasn't his usual self anymore, walking with his head down and avoiding the spots where our friend groups usually hung out. Someone told me they'd heard Marina screaming at him in their driveway about how ashamed she was of what their family had put me through, and apparently she'd been sleeping in the guest room since the night of the board meeting. His dad wasn't at the school board meetings anymore either, and rumor was he might resign before his term was up, because other board members were freezing him out after his behavior during my hearing. 2 weeks later, the school board held another vote to officially revise the zero-tolerance policy to include emergency exception protocols, and this time it passed 7-0 since Clint wasn't there to vote against it. They wanted to name it after Mr. Baker, but she asked them to just call it the Emergency Life Safety Exception, because she said it wasn't about her, it was about protecting everyone. The local news picked up the story and ran it as their lead, calling it a victory for common sense over bureaucracy. And they interviewed Ms. Baker, who used the opportunity to talk about how many other policies needed similar review. Logan Hood got appointed to lead a new committee on policy reform, and within 3 weeks of my case being resolved, other students started coming forward with their own stories about zero-tolerance policies that had hurt them. The district announced they were launching a full review of all their policies, and Logan told me privately that my case had opened the floodgates for changes people had been wanting for years. Jasmine decided to throw me a celebration party at her house, and when the night came, I was shocked to see several teachers show up after hours, including some who'd never even taught me but wanted to show their support. Miss Baker stood up on a chair in Jasmine's living room and gave this speech about courage and doing what's right even when it costs everything, raising her red Solo cup in a toast while everyone cheered. We all pretended not to see Principal Harris's car drive slowly past the house twice during the party, and someone joked that he was probably trying to find a policy violation to shut us down. A week after that, my dad finally got released from the hospital after being there for almost 2 months, and the first thing he wanted to do was personally thank everyone who'd helped me. He spent days writing letters to each board member who'd voted in my favor, and he sent this huge flower arrangement to Marina with a note thanking her for her support and the summer school money. He told me that watching me fight through everything while he was stuck in that hospital bed had actually helped his recovery, because it gave him something positive to focus on, instead of his own problems. About a month after the board meeting, I got this official-looking envelope in the mail from something called the Moral Courage Foundation, and inside was a letter saying they'd heard about my story and wanted to offer me a scholarship. It was specifically for students who'd shown exceptional moral courage in difficult circumstances, and the amount was enough to cover everything my financial aid package didn't, which meant I could go to college without taking out any loans or asking my parents to pay anything. The next week, Ms. Baker called me over after class to show me something in the hallway. She pointed to a new red box mounted on the wall with a clear glass door, and inside I could see 3 different inhalers labeled with teacher names. She explained the district had rushed through approval for emergency medication stations after what happened to us, and now every hallway had one with a 30-second access code that all staff knew. The boxes were going up in every school in the district, and she kept saying how many lives this could save, how no student would ever have to make the choice I did. 2 days later, I got a call from the superintendent's office asking me to come in for a meeting, and when I arrived, she offered me a seat on the new student advisory board they were creating. She said they needed student voices in policy decisions, and my first proposal about mandatory emergency medical training for all staff went through without a single no vote. Even Principal Harris raised his hand in favor. That same afternoon, Marina called my cell and asked if I could meet her at a coffee shop downtown. She showed up looking different, more relaxed somehow, and told me she'd filed for separation from Clint after everything that happened. She said watching me fight for what was right had inspired her to make changes in her own life, and she wanted to offer me a summer internship at her law firm, helping with cases involving students facing unfair disciplinary actions. I accepted on the spot, and she smiled bigger than I'd ever seen her smile before. The weeks flew by with finals and graduation prep, and then suddenly it was graduation day, and the assistant principal pulled me aside to say they wanted me to give a speech about integrity and courage. I stood at that podium looking out at hundreds of faces and talked about how sometimes the right thing means breaking the rules, how systems need room for humanity, how a life is worth more than any policy. Mrs. Baker sat in the front row looking healthy for the first time all year, tears running down her face as she clapped. After the ceremony ended and we were all throwing our caps in the air, Cameron walked up to me without his usual smirk. He told me his grades had tanked during all the controversy and he wasn't valedictorian anymore. Then he actually apologized, said his mom had made him understand what he'd almost cost me. I told him I accepted his apology, but we'd never be friends, and he nodded like he understood that was fair. The next morning, Principal Harris sent out an email to all staff and students announcing his early retirement effective at the end of summer school. At the farewell assembly, he gave this speech about how rigid policies sometimes fail to account for human complexity, and everyone knew he was talking about my case even though he never said my name. That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from him. But honestly, it was enough. Marina's law firm turned out to be exactly where I needed to be that summer. She taught me how to research cases and write briefs, and most importantly, how to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She told me my case had been the final push she needed to leave her marriage and pursue the kind of law that actually helped people instead of just making money. We worked on 3 cases that summer where students had been punished under zero-tolerance policies, and we got all 3 overturned using my case as precedent. In August, right before I had to leave for college, I got a thick envelope from Ms. Baker with a handwritten letter inside. She thanked me again and included this photo of her with 5 little kids who turned out to be her grandkids at their elementary school graduation. She wrote that she got to see them graduate because I saved her life, and she'd started a foundation to help students facing disciplinary actions in emergency situations. She'd already helped 2 kids in other districts who'd been in similar situations to mine. Logan called me a few days later to tell me about the new principal they'd hired, someone who'd already started revising policies to include compassion and context in decision-making. He said the culture shift at the school was incredible, with teachers feeling like they could actually use judgment instead of just following rules blindly. He told me everyone knew my case had started the change, and the new principal had specifically mentioned it in her first staff meeting. That same week, I got an email from some group called the National Education Reform Coalition, saying they'd heard about my story and wanted to feature it in their campaign against zero-tolerance policy failures. I did 2 phone interviews and 1 video call, but mostly I just wanted to focus on getting ready for college. They told me later that my story had been used to change policies in 3 other states where similar situations had happened, but students hadn't been as lucky with their outcomes. The week before I left for college, I walked through the school one more time to pick up my final transcript and saw bright red emergency medication boxes mounted on the walls every 30 feet. Each box had a clear glass front showing inhalers, EpiPens, and other emergency meds with a sign that said, "Break glass in emergency, no student will be punished." The nurse's office had a new sign showing extended hours until 6 p.m. every day, and I watched her training 3 assistant nurses on emergency response procedures. Logan stopped me in the hallway to show me the new policy manual where page 12 had a whole section called Good Samaritan Protection for Students, that basically said any student helping in a medical emergency was protected from all disciplinary action, no matter what rules they had to break. Jasmine threw me this huge going-away party at her house the night before I left, and even Marina showed up with a bottle of champagne and this massive cake that said, "Future lawyer in frosting." She pulled me aside to tell me her divorce from Clint was final, and she'd started a nonprofit legal aid group specifically for students facing unfair disciplinary actions. "I want you to work for me every summer through law school if you decide to go that route," she said, handing me a business card with her new organization's logo. The next morning, my parents loaded up the car with all my stuff, and we started the 5-hour drive to campus with Dad looking healthier than he had in years, and Mom playing my favorite music the whole way. Dad kept looking at me in the rearview mirror, and finally said that watching me fight the system while he was sick gave him something to focus on besides the chemo, and it actually helped him get through treatment. Mom reached back to squeeze my hand and told me she'd never been prouder of anything in her entire life than watching me stand up for what was right, even when it cost me everything. At freshman orientation, my roommate looked at me funny when I introduced myself, and then her eyes got huge and she said she'd read about my case in 3 different newspapers. "It's such an honor to room with someone who actually stood up to injustice instead of just complaining about it online," she said, and we stayed up until 3 a.m. that first night talking about everything. Mrs. Baker started emailing me these long updates every month about her health getting better and all the changes happening at the school since my case. She'd become this huge advocate for teacher health accommodations and was working with the district to get better insurance coverage for chronic conditions. In October, she wrote that she'd been asked to speak at a state education conference about how rigid policies can literally kill people, and she was dedicating her presentation to me. That same month, I got invited to speak at this big education reform conference where actual policymakers and superintendents would be listening. I stood on that stage in front of 200 people and told them exactly what happened when I saved Mr. Baker's life, and how the system tried to destroy me for it. They gave me this huge honorarium check that covered all my textbooks for the entire year, plus some left over for next semester. Marina's nonprofit had already successfully challenged 3 other zero-tolerance cases in our district by using my case as precedent, and she called me one night to ask if I'd be on her board of advisors. Your case changed my entire life direction, she said, and I could hear actual happiness in her voice for the first time since I'd known her. Spring semester, I pulled straight A's again, while also volunteering at the campus legal aid clinic and speaking at 2 more conferences about education reform. My professors kept telling me I had a gift for advocacy, and one of them wrote me a recommendation for this amazing summer internship at a civil rights law firm. Marina sent me updates about every case her nonprofit won, and by May, they'd helped 14 students get unfair punishments overturned using strategies we'd developed from my situation. As I packed up my dorm room after finals, I sat there looking at my 4.0 transcript, and all the thank you letters from students Marina had helped, and realized something huge. That horrible day when I thought saving Ms. Baker's life had ruined mine actually turned out to be the day that saved me too, because it showed me exactly what I was meant to do with my life. It taught me how to fight against unfair systems and connected me with mentors like Marina, who showed me how to turn that fight into real change for other people. Sometimes the absolute worst day of your life becomes the foundation for everything good that comes after, and you realize that saving someone else's life ended up saving your own in ways you never could have imagined. Thanks for letting me question things with you all today. It's been quite the journey together. Until we wonder about something else. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.